Where the Pyramid Meets the Eye, parts 1 through 3 can be found at batshitcave.blogspot.com. Part 1 was posted Monday, November 11th, 2024. When most people think of 60s psychedelic music, San Francisco usually comes to mind. But as the late Dave McGowan points out in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, many of the icons of that movement originally convened in the LA area. Bands like The Doors, the Mamas and the Papas, Frank Zappa and the Mothers, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, and so on. But then there was the 13th Floor Elevators from Austin, Texas, arguably the very first psychedelic band. When asked what his definition of psychedelic music was, Erickson replied, "That's where the pyramid meets the eye," from 20th Century Rock and Roll Psychedelia by Scott F. Belmer. Much has been said and written about the 13th Floor Elevators, but one curious detail that I find often seems glossed over is their prominent use of the Eye of Providence symbol. What did the Eye of Providence symbol mean to most people who saw it in the year 1965? Let's remember, this was way before people like Jordan Maxwell, Bill Cooper, Art Bell, David Icke, and Alex Jones were sounding the alarm about the Illuminati and Mockingbird Media. I don't believe there was this automatic paranoia, fear, excitement, or even awareness of the Illuminati at that time. What there was a yearning for genuine spiritual experiences and, quote, mind expansion. Given that, it is very easy to see how this eye in the pyramid symbol would resonate with that very endeavor. I mean, think about it. Who wouldn't have wanted the secret password to take a spiritual journey 13 floors up to the top of the Giza pyramid and meet the eye of God? You don't have to be a member of a secret society to appreciate the basic gist of the symbol. I'm sure it revealed itself easily enough to the average acid head. On that note, there was probably nobody more aware of the eye's symbolic meaning than a common Freemason, as it appears prominently on their ceremonial aprons and artistic renderings going back to the 1700s, possibly even earlier. How we get from Freemasons to young hippies tripping on acid is an interesting connection to contemplate. Were Freemasons involved in the 60s psychedelic movement? I don't know, but let's take that trip and see where it goes. I came up with the elevators part of the name, he claims. The next day, after Clementine, Tommy Hall's wife, had slept on it, she came back in the morning with 13th Floor Elevators, according to John Ike Walton, as reported by the Austin Chronicle. Though it's disputed amongst members, Hall said she, Clementine, came up with the band's full name and later added the 13th floor for her lucky number. Though the Elevators part of the name seems to be in dispute, Walton, the drummer, and Hall, jug player, lyricist, appear to be in agreement about Clementine adding the 13. But who decided to add the Eye of Providence symbol, and how does this relate to what the band was supposedly doing? As you go up in levels of abstraction, it has the tendency of leading to one idea. That's why the pyramid works as a model for consciousness. With the eye, it leads to perception. That's according to Hall, as stated by proxymusic.club. And here we have the reverse side of the first 13th Floor Elevators album, and you can see there's 13 layers, and if you count the bricks, there's actually 65 in there. In contrast to the Eye of Providence symbol here, which, according to Manly P. Hall, 33-degree Freemason, there are 72 bricks concealed within here, as well as the 13 layers. And there's a link here to more on that specific topic. Besides the historical significance of America's original 13 colonies, 13 is also a significant number within the esoteric context, meaning many into one. Compare this with the 13 letters composing the Latin phrase found above, written upon the ribbon held within the eagle's mouth, E pluribus unum, meaning from the many one. What did Tommy Hall say about the pyramid eye symbol earlier? As you go up in levels of abstraction, it has the tendency of leading to one idea. Sounds like he had a pretty good grasp of the intended messages contained therein by the authors of these symbols. So what is the significance of the 65 bricks found within the pyramid depicted on the back of the 13th Floor Elevators album shown earlier? That happens to have Hebrew Kabbalistic relevance as well, and is also found on the US $1 bill by way of the stars above the eagle's head, which are 13 pentacles, 5-pointed stars. 13 times 5 equals 65. The eagle also has 33 feathers on one side of its wingspan and 32 on the other, which has Scottish Rite Freemasonic significance. 33 plus 32 also happens to be 65. I don't think these numbers are accidental, and someone in the elevators camp seems to have had a level of awareness regarding all of this occult information. I suspect Tommy Hall was one of them. Now let me just review what we just were talking about there. So 5 pointed stars, there's 13 of them. 5 times 13 is 65. Remember the number 65 here? There's 65 bricks here. So what I'm saying is there seems to be a consistency in terms of the knowledge of numbers as they relate to these symbols here. And if you count these feathers, there's 33 on one side and 32 on the other. 33 plus 32 is 65. The above image of Tommy Hall appears in the 2020 publication 13th Floor Elevators, A Visual History. I think anyone can see that this was not some quickly captured candid moment, as Hall is clearly posing for the camera here. What do you suppose this means, and why would he want it included in the book? There may be a perfectly innocent explanation, or perhaps it was just done randomly without much thought. But if one simply takes it at face value, the occult suggestion is quite obvious. And here's a statue of Harpocratic Eros, terracotta figurine made in Myrina, Greece, circa 100 to 50 BC. Ptolemaic bronze Harpocrates, same facial expression, naked child. Aleister Crowley utilized Harpocrates' mythology and symbolism heavily in his occult magic rituals. I believe that is an eye within the pyramid printed on his forehead, by the way, right there. Here he is making the same pose Tommy Hall is above. George Martin of Beatles fame also does this spontaneously in an interview when he was asked about whether the Beatles really played or wrote certain parts of their recordings.
In several songs, there is a kind of Lutheran stroke Anglican harmony going on. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think you know what I mean. Blackbird. And Yesterday. These are hymn-like harmonies with hymn-like bass lines, and they crop up all over the place for no one. They're using inversions where the bass isn't the root chord. There are all sorts of things going on. And my question is, where's this coming from?
Harpo Marx got his name from playing the harp, apparently. I'm sure his silence had nothing to do with Harpocrates. Harpocrates is an ancient Greek god of silence, secrets, and confidentiality in the Hellenistic religion developed in Ptolemaic Alexandria, and also an embodiment of hope, according to Plutarch. Greeks adapted Harpocrates from the Egyptian child god Horus, who represented the newborn sun, rising each day at dawn. The name Harpocrates originated as a Hellenization of the Egyptian Harpa-Kered, or Heru-Pa-Kered, meaning Horus the child. Depictions showed Horus as a naked boy with his finger to his mouth, a realization of the hieroglyph for child. Misunderstanding this gesture, later Greeks and Roman poets made Harpocrates the god of silence and secrecy. So what am I trying to say here? That Tommy Hall was or is an occultist just because he put his finger to his mouth in a photo? Well, no. But consider this bit of dialogue found at Freemasonry.bcy.ca. This is some kind of interview. Alan Vorda said, "Who came up with the logo of the pyramid with the eye? The pyramid and eye logo comes from the backside of the $1 bill, which states Annuit Coeptus, and has exactly 13 layers of bricks in the pyramid." And the word Annuit Coeptus also has 13 letters, by the way. A man named Powell St. John responds, "It was one of those arcane symbols of which Tommy was so fond and so vague in explaining. Maybe it had something to do with Scientology. Tommy was very big in Scientology." Now these names, Alan Vorda and Powell St. John, these are credible individuals historically and were either involved with the band directly or indirectly at various points in time. So these words carry some weight. And Tommy's involvement with Scientology is no secret, nor is his fascination with the esoteric. But why was this information found on a website for the Freemasonic Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon? Why do Freemasons care about the logo of some 60s psychedelic band? The above interview excerpt seems to be on a page dedicated to anti-Freemasonry. Anti-Freemasonry is a name Freemasons have given to any ideas or concepts regarding Freemasonry that they either don't want the public commonly knowing about or that they feel is untrue or must be corrected for the record. But oddly, the page doesn't seem to be attempting to debunk anything. On the contrary, it hints that Tommy Hall may have had more of a connection to the Eye of Providence symbol than he let on, leaving almost any possibility on the table. I doubt it had much to do with Scientology, but I suppose it's possible. Now, Roky Erickson, the singer for the 13th Floor Elevators, he had a lot of mental issues and ended up in some insane asylum. And when he came out in the late 70s, he formed this band, Roky and the Aliens. So that's a picture of them right there, and they had a horror theme. So here's a statement by Bill Miller of the Aliens. In Austin, the whole scene was centered around one thing, which was the Elevators. And all the other bands were sort of patterned after the Elevators. The Elevators were designed from day one, before anyone had ever heard them, when they were still rehearsing and planning the whole thing. In the very early planning stages, the Elevators were designed to be a cult item, and they invested the cult item. That's from Demon Angel, A Day and Night in the Life of Roky Erickson. Now, why does Bill Miller seem to be going out of his way in the above quote to drive home the contrived nature of the Elevators? Perhaps there was a faction within the group that was wildly organic, namely the Roky Erickson component. But the Tommy Hall factor seems to me where the contrived part comes in. And it's probably fair to say that the band would never have existed without those two components coming together. While Erickson tends to get most of the press, I believe Tommy Hall's angle has been far less understood. He is usually explored from the perspective of glorifying his obsession with spiritual endeavors, allowing it all to comfortably settle somewhere in the middle of psychedelic hippie history, never to be quite understood or explained completely. He, Hall, was a pharmacology major at the time he was in college and interested in what drugs do to people. And he became more and more interested in that. And eventually he came to the point where that was really all he was interested in, except music. That's according to Sandy Lockett, Elevator's sound man. I think he had a master's degree. He was teaching the UT English department. He was a very dogmatic fellow, wore a suit and was kind of chubby. That's according to Spencer Perskin of Shiva's Headband, who I believe played with the Elevators a lot. This is a picture of Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey began writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1960 after completing a graduate fellowship in creative writing at Stanford University. The novel was an immediate commercial and critical success when published 2 years later. During this period, Kesey participated in CIA-financed studies involving hallucinogenic drugs, including mescaline and LSD, to supplement his income. And here's a flyer for an acid test. The acid tests were a series of parties held by author Ken Kesey, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area during the mid-1960s, centered on the use of and advocacy for the psychedelic drug LSD, commonly known as acid. LSD was not made illegal in California until October 6, 1966. 27 November, Sokol, California was the first acid test, and that was a party at Ken Babb's house on 27 November 1965. Owsley Stanley III, also known as Bear, also known as Acid King. Stanley was the first known private individual to manufacture mass quantities of LSD. By his own account, between 1965 and 1967, Stanley produced at least 500 grams of LSD, amounting to little more than 5 million doses. In 1963, he enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, where he became involved in the psychoactive drug scene. He dropped out after a semester, took a technical job at KGO-TV, and began producing LSD in a small lab located in the bathroom of a house near campus. he used his Berkeley lab to buy 500 grams of lysergic acid monohydrate, the basis for LSD. His first shipment arrived on March 30th, 1965, and he produced 300,000 hits, or 270 micrograms each. That's 270 micrograms each of LSD by May 1965. According to Hank Harrison, he, Stanley, was the guy that whipped up the acid at Berkeley at the 3rd or 4th floor of the chem lab. On campus, man. That's the only place they could make LSD from scratch, where they had the actual equipment. Let's not forget that history seems to indicate that the rather sudden injection of LSD into 60s American counterculture seemed to involve college universities, as well as the CIA. Stanford in the case of Ken Kesey, Berkeley in the case of Stanley. What was Tommy Hall up to at the University of Texas, where he was literally studying how drugs affect living organisms? Tommy wanted to create this utopia in his own mind. You know, what drugs to take, when to take them. Mescaline in the morning, LSD at night. That's according to Michael Erickson, one of Roky Erickson's brothers. It got to the point where the drugs were a problem for the other fellows, and they were always putting pressure on me to get high with them. I just got to the point where I got tired of being bugged about it. I saw the kind of consciousness that it was bringing about, and it was paranoia. I tried to get Stacy to stop, but they just argue with me. Rocky's second acid trip hurt him. Hurt me too. Tommy gave us too much. I had a real bad trip, and so did he, but he didn't admit that he had a real bad trip. He kept on taking the acid, thinking everything would get better. I quit. I didn't want another one of those experiences. I was scared, but Stacy and Tommy and Roky were not scared. Consequently, they got in all kinds of trouble. That's according to John Ike Walton, the drummer for 13-4 Elevators. Now, while you're sitting there contemplating all these tabs of LSD and how it coincided with the dawn of the 60s psychedelic revolution, ponder this. The first CIA-sponsored acid test occurred in November of 1965. Members of the Warlocks, later known as the Grateful Dead, were present. The 13th floor elevators were formed the following month in Austin, Texas, in December of 1965. Where and how was Tommy getting his acid, and how crucial a role did this play in the formation of the elevators? And here's a picture of the original Magic Bus taken by the merry pranksters who toured across the country promoting LSD and other drugs in the name of mind expansion or something. Here's the inside of the bus. Larry McMurdy befriended Ken Kesey when he attended Stanford University during the 1960-61 academic year. In 1964, Kesey and his merry pranksters conducted their noted cross-country trip, stopping at McMurdy's home in Houston. Texas was no stranger to LSD at the time of the Houston acid test in March 1967. In fact, it could be argued that along with California, Texas was the pioneering U.S. state for a non-academic psychedelic culture. Experiments with peyote and morning glory seeds began among college students in the early 1960s, and in 1965, use of marijuana and early batches of non-pharmaceutical LSD was common in hip circles. Even obscure drugs like DMT could be obtained. All the elements of an underground culture were in place. The main difference to the West Coast was that the early psychedelic phase in Texas was concentrated to one specific spot, the University of Texas, or UT, in Austin. Out of this bohemian college scene came artists and performers like Janis Joplin and Gilbert Shelton, and a foundation was laid for famous music venues like the Vulcan Gas Company and the Armadillo World Headquarters in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The UT and Austin also gave birth to what is generally considered the first psychedelic rock group, the 13th Floor Elevators, who formed in December 1965 and had an LSD-oriented agenda from day one. With the help of the Elevators and reasonably open-minded scene makers like writer Jim Langdon and radio station owner Bill Josie in Austin, writer/promoter Scott Holtzman, and TV show host Larry Kane in Houston, the Texans were ahead even of the SF Bay Area with regards to psychedelic music. Holtzman wrote a newspaper column in July 1966 on how psychedelia was all the rage among teenagers in Houston, while it would be several months before the rest of the U.S. caught on in larger numbers. And that's from Lysergia.com. We played about 3 months before we went to California, and we came back to Austin after California and recorded our first album. They, the Grateful Dead, were taking dope together, but they weren't making music together on the dope, if you see what I mean. Only later, after they were allowed to by Tommy and his bunch. And that's John Ike Walton again. It seems the Texas psychedelic culture began with Ken Kesey's CIA-sponsored Merry Pranksters stopping off at his friend Larry McMurtry's house in 1964, then culminated into a full-blown acid test at Rice University in Houston in 1967, which was apparently the last one. The last acid test, that is. In between is where the psychedelic culture was cultivated and centered around the University of Texas, where Tommy Hall was studying how drugs affect people. And to quote the above article, the UT and Austin also gave birth to what is generally considered the first psychedelic rock group, the 13th Floor Elevators. Take note of Walton's quote above, where he states the Grateful Dead weren't making music on dope when the Elevators first arrived to the Bay Area 3 months after forming. It was later when they were, quote, allowed to by Tommy and his bunch. Now that is some very interesting wording, because he seems to be referring to a group of people Tommy was affiliated with that were separate from the band. And they apparently had control of who took the drugs. And it sounds like they literally gave the Dead permission to do so. This is backed up somewhat by Billy Gibbons, that's of ZZ Top, in the documentary You're Gonna Miss Me, where he basically states that all the Bay Area bands were soft and folksy until the Elevators blew through town. Where the Pyramid Meets the Eye, Part 2, posted Thursday, November 21st, 2024 at batshitcave.blogspot.com. Here's a picture of Stacy Sutherland, guitar player for the 13th Floor Elevators. Here's a band photo. There's Stacy, Tommy Hall, and John, the drummer. First thing to say about Stacy is, hell of a guitar player. Another thing to say about him is that he was a haunted man. He realized that the devil was after him. I'm not sure why he concluded that, but he did. He would sit there and play the guitar, and the devil was 2 steps behind him all the way. And he wasn't sure whether that was because he was consorting with the wrong people, or because he hadn't prayed that night, or because he was fooling around with fancy women, or what. But he knew the devil was after him. And that's according to Sandy Lockett, sound man for 13th Floor Elevators. And there's his Stacy Sutherland's tombstone right there. Died August 24th, 1978. And there's a picture of Stacy's mother, Mrs. Sybil Sutherland. From the time he was 14, he was really a happy little boy. In the year he was 14, there was some big change in his life. I never knew what. That time on, he seemed sort of depressed. There were evidently a lot of things changing in his life at that time, sort of a sad look in all these pictures from that point on. I had one of the teachers say to me, well, I think he's on drugs. I asked him one time later, where'd you get the drugs? And he said it was the clean-cut college kids that came home from the weekends from over at Austin that brought it here. You couldn't kick over a rock without finding some, said Sybil Sutherland. Stacy Sutherland was born in 1946, so he would have been about 14 in 1960, the year his mother noticed a dark shift in his character. Sybil Sutherland comes off as a very sweet, observant woman, but from another time where American culture was not as cynical and tolerant of blatant drug use as it is today. Given that, it would have been harder for someone of her generation to spot drug-induced behavior. She obviously picked up on something being off, but was probably hesitant to conclude her beloved son was a drug fiend. We read in part 1 that it could be argued that along with California, Texas was the pioneering U.S. state for a non-academic psychedelic culture. Experiments with peyote and morning glory seeds began among college students in the early 1960s, and in 1965, use of marijuana and early batches of non-pharmaceutical LSD was common in hip circles. Given that Stacy seemed to be getting his drugs from the clean-cut college kids, the big picture comes into focus pretty easily. Sutherland was probably exposed to something too strong and too early, forever shattering his innocence and darkening his perception. How much of that was from drugs or some other outside influence, we can only guess. I'm going to guess it was probably a combination of the two. Back when he, Stacy, was in high school, he used to go out to a certain teacher's house, and I got kind of perturbed over that, because here was a lady teacher who lived alone, and she was probably in her 50s, and all high school boys were going out there. I had myself been in her home, and she had walls of books on religions. And he said, "That's all we do, Mother. Go out and talk about religion. You won't believe that, but that's what it is." And this may have been the beginning of some of this Zen and Eastern religion, I don't know. That's again according to Sybil Sutherland, Stacy's mother. Although the idea of young high school boys going over to some older female teacher's house to, quote, talk about religion might sound pretty questionable today, the cultural climate of the 1960s should be considered. It seems there was a genuine yearning for some kind of spiritual enlightenment going on at that time, which happened to coincide with the heaping of recreational drugs upon the population. I don't think that was a coincidence. And this is a picture of Anne Elizabeth Bunny Bunnell, Stacy's wife, who allegedly shot and killed him. Her nickname was Bunny. The 13th floor elevators lasted only a few years. Their fame and recognition in the bigger picture of the birth of the psychedelic music is something that has come to be more and more appreciated on a larger scale over time. Unfortunately, I don't think Stacy lived long enough to witness much of this appreciation. It seems his time on this earth only became darker after the elevators and during the years leading up to his death. I'd say, well, look at the band and the things that have happened to all of you. And if you were really right, it looks like something good would happen and come of it, and not all the bad things that have, because Roky had gone to Rusk mental hospital and Stacy had gone to prison. I think he turned to drinking when he went over here to the state when they said there wasn't anything wrong with him. They said, true, he has experimented with drugs, but he wasn't addicted to any of them. But he does have an alcoholic personality, and if he doesn't get a hold of himself, this may be the route he'll take. That's again according to his mother. A Houston Chronicle article from 1978 read, "A Montrose resident was shot to death today in his residence at 516 Pacifica Street. Police identified the victim as Stacy Keith Sutherland, 33. Shot once in the stomach with a .22 caliber rifle at 3:30 a.m. Sutherland died at 5:07 a.m. in Ben Taub Hospital. Officers arrested a 34-year-old woman at the scene. No charges have been filed." The going narrative of what happened that night seems to come from longtime friend and former Montrose neighbor Jim Horde. According to Jim Horde, Stacy had a very bad temper, and the alcohol brought out the worst in him. But Stacy and Bunny brought out the worst in each other. The house was always dirty, and it was infested with roaches. Bunny wasn't the best housekeeper. Every time I went over to visit, the condition of the house used to really bug me. Bunny had some really bad times in her life, but the time she spent with Stacy was the worst. Stacy was making threatening remarks and acting belligerent toward Bunny's 15-year-old son, and when Stacy lunged at Bunny in an attempt to enter her son's bedroom, she pulled the trigger to the .22 rifle that the couple kept in the house for protection against burglars. Now here's what Stacy's mother had to say about that incident. "I told you that she, Bunny, called me 3 times during the time they were married, which was about 15 months. It was always at 3:30 in the morning, and told me she was going to kill him. And this would throw me into a panic, of course, and I tried to tell him, Stacy that is, and he kept saying, she doesn't mean it. She's a gentle, sweet girl, and she would never do anything like that. And I'd say, well, why did she call me? And why did she... It was just like a different person. She was afraid of him, and he had earlier bought a gun and some shells and showed her how to use them. And the boy who lived with them, this Tony, said that when they came in, she was sitting in the kitchen with a butcher knife. And he tried to talk to both of them because they were both angry and they had been arguing earlier in the day. And they went out and drank some beer and came back and he was still angry. And he, Tony, tried to say something to him and he said, Stacy said, keep out of this. It ain't your affair. And he, Tony, said, I went off into my room and then I shut the door. Then I heard the shot. and when I ran in there, she was standing with the gun in her hand. Now let's look at some numbers here. Sybil said Bunny called her 3 times, always at 3:30 a.m., talking about how she was going to kill Stacy. Can you imagine? According to the Houston Chronicle, Stacy was shot at 3:30 a.m. The same Houston Chronicle article states Stacy was 33, but according to his tombstone, he was 32. If the above is accurate, how can it be that Bunny just happens to shoot Stacy at the exact time in the morning she called his mother previously threatening to kill him? This points towards a premeditated action or some kind of constructed narrative involving the number 33. And this is Stacy's tombstone, which has the 13th floor elevator's Eye of Providence symbol on it. With Sybil's recounting of 3 times being called by Bunny at 3:30 in the morning, the actual shooting at 3:30 in the morning, and the apparently inaccurate statement by the Chronicle that Stacy was 33 at the time of death, that's 5 occurrences of the number 33 related to this incident, and I'm guessing there's probably more somewhere. Other than just being spooky as hell, what is the deal with this number being all over the place? Number 33 came up in a previous blog where we were looking at the Great Seal of America on the $1 bill, which happens to include the same pyramid eye symbol used by the 13th floor elevators. We made the Masonic connection of 33 feathers on the eagle's left wing and 32 on the right, having to do with degrees within the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. We observed that 33 plus 32 equals 65, the same number found above the eagle's head. That's right there. Encoded within the 13 pentacles, or 5-pointed stars, within the Star of David. 5 times 13 equals 65. In Hebrew gematria, 65 corresponds to the Gam Yeshad, which is related to an often used Freemasonic term, according to W. Bro David Barrett. 33 also happens to be the age of Jesus Christ when he was crucified. The number 33 is associated with divine significance in the Bible and is often linked to the Holy Trinity and blessings. It can also signify divine favor and presence. Point being, this number 33 has very relevant occult symbolic significance, especially considering the pyramid eye symbol stamped upon Stacy's tombstone. We're talking about Hebrew Egyptian mysticism, as appropriated by the Freemasons, who obviously chose the symbols which appear on the US dollar bill. Getting back to the narrative regarding the murder of Stacy Sutherland, the boy Tony, as Sybil recounts it, doesn't seem to mention anything about a neighbor, Jim Horde, being there, even though Horde is quoted in the Chronicle as if he'd witnessed what happened. I feel like there's something fishy about this Horde guy, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. As far as I can tell, the account of Horde and Sybil Sutherland are the most specific details the public got regarding this tragedy. So what actually happened here? The murder itself was tragic and involved unstable individuals under the influence. Obviously, domestic disputes can get violent, nothing so out of the ordinary there. But this was no average couple, as Stacy was, even then, a somewhat famous person of note, especially in the annals of American 60s psychedelic lore. Whatever magic was behind this cultural movement, Stacy was most certainly a powerful conduit for that force, and willfully embodied that yearning for enlightenment we find so often regarding stories about the hippies, which ironically led him down a path of darkness in the end. And according to Sandy Lockett, it sounds like the devil was there waiting for him. Lord have mercy. Rest in peace, Stacy Sutherland. Where the Pyramid Meets the Eye, Part 3 can be found at batshitcave.blogspot.com and was posted Friday, November 22nd, 2024. And it's composed of a transcript of Roky Erickson's spoken word poem, I Know the Hole in Baby's Head, followed by some Freedom of Information Act documents.
I know the hole in baby's head. 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 I live together with my family in an old house. I have a big family. I have lots of brothers and lots of sisters. I have lots of baby brothers and sisters all over the house, crying, screaming, crawling, and playing in dangerous areas, moaning and wailing like dirty, disarrayed toys. They fall down a lot. My mother and father fight all the time. My mother leaves the house dirty all the time, always feeding the babies, always leaving the babies crying and screaming while she cries all the time. And then she looks up from the bed screaming at the top of her lungs, hoping someone understands her. We ain't got much money to buy much electricity, and the house is always dark and old. My dad thinks he owns the house, and I'm so afraid someone's going to get tired of him coming and going and walking real loud and owning all the house, rattling drawers in his bedroom, slamming doors all the time, leaving all the time, staying out late all the time, coming home real late at night. I like to think it's normal in my old house. Our old house is in the middle of about 7 or 6 vacant houses in the woods off an old deserted road in the neighborhood in the woods. I like to think everything is all right in my old house, my old dark house, but I know it isn't. I've always had bad feelings about all the garbage and dirt and darkness and spider webs and bad smells, and bad feelings scare you. Bad feelings about the kids. Never being fed and being too cold and not having any toys. Not having enough toys, fighting over the toys, screaming and crying over the other kid's broken single toy. My mother always walking around in her robe and crying and never having any soap to wash piles of dirty dishes that she's always too upset to wash, and my dad always coming in and out of the house night and day and never speaking to anyone. Never speaking to no one, and never speaking to anyone. So when I first had these bad feelings, I had the bad feeling something wasn't right about the atmosphere in the old house. I thought that things could be pretty weird in the old house, the dark old house. That things had too much tension, that things were a little wilder than I thought. As time went on, my feelings about that, the atmosphere could be weird, grew into scarier. Then as more time went on, I started thinking that maybe there could be weird things that could lay dormant in the old darkness of the old dark house. So I started thinking that maybe there could be other things, other strange things that I didn't know about happening in the old house. So I tried to think what these things could be. I started thinking things could be getting dangerous, and I started wondering what weird could be happening in the darkness. Why would the big family exist with nothing to have exist on other than just the family, than just the big family, than just the family I wanted to be my brothers and sisters' friends, but they were very unhappy. I started wondering what was weird or extra strange about the environment of the crowded poor family. Why would they just exist on nothing but themselves and the feeling around the kids in the dark and darkness? How could the kids exist on so little and be just like flora and fauna? Just fixtures, like furniture and objects in the dark old house. The house was dark in the daytime. 2, just single objects with 1 or 2 broken toys. My mother always kept to herself. Always worried. My mother always worried. Always worried. My mother was always worried. Always worried. My dad always leaving the old house and coming in the old house a lot all the time. Then I got to thinking that maybe something had happened, something more than that they couldn't talk about. Something that they were too stupid to understand, and something they were too quiet of to be knowing of that it was bad. My mother always kept to herself. My mother was always in her own world. My father was always extremely real introverted. My father never thought an outside thought. I went on thinking, what could be wrong or strange? Was it that there was just something flora and fauna or unfurnished about the large, poor, transient family? Why was there nothing but darkness and space, nothing but the big, poor family in the old house, and just air, space, and clear, dirty, dusty, musty, moldy, squeaky, spidery, webby, stale, bad smells, bad smelling air, and atmosphere dark like all outside? The family figures. Then I thought there must be something terribly wrong with them. They were too alone and a big poor family. And I thought they must have done something terribly wrong, something that they were too stupid to be unharmful in what they had done. So, do you think they had killed someone? Do you think they could have gotten along through the tension, the hysteria between them to have successfully together killed someone? Someone they knew was still with them. Someone that was still and quiet now and calm. And they just carried on their everyday life, unthinking of anything different. What's happening? Like nothing ever happened. I went and thought they had killed someone, and I got real scared. I got real scared and went into vertigo at the thought. I went and thought that they had killed someone, and then I thought they had killed this someone. Then I thought, how have they killed this someone? Who was this someone had they killed? And then to reach and thought, then I reached and thought, I snapped, that they had killed one of my brothers or sisters. One of the many, one of the babies. One of the many, one of the babies, one of the many. One of the many, one of the many. I thought they had killed one of the kids. One of the babies. They had killed one of the kids. They had killed the kid, like one of their poor broken little toys. They had killed a kid. And then I got real paranoid, and I started thinking, and I got to feeling someone's thoughts on mine, and I got to feeling their thoughts on mine, and I could feel that they were thinking of me and thinking of my thoughts. And I got real paranoid. Oh my God. I know the hole in baby's head.
I tacked on some of these Freedom of Information Act documents at the end of this. They're not very informative, but when we talk about how Roky Erickson died and what exactly happened, it's just kind of this big, it's almost like nobody cares, like, you know, and I don't know that anything really nefarious happened, that there's any conspiracy, but if anyone wants, you can go and look at these documents. If you click on them, they'll blow up and you can see them more clearly. I'm not really going to go over them. It's all very depressing and not very informative, but it's there for anyone who wants to look at it. I find it kind of interesting that this last page is almost completely redacted. Anyhow, this completes my series on the 13th floor elevators.